Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to be practicing everything that we've learned so far in the value section of this class. We'll be applying the highlights to shadows and the cast shadows to the shapes that we drew in the perspective lessons. The reason why we're doing this is to get used to the full process, from once you've drawn the shape, and then adding the shadows, the cast shadows, and understanding where you choose for the light source to be. This is all part of the practice, because the more that you do this, the more it will be ingrained within you, so when you are drawing something, it'll become a lot more easier in order to make it look realistic. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a bunch of shapes which are all shaded in a realistic way with a light source that you've chosen. Okay, so the exercise for this lesson is we're going to be playing around with the different light sources. So with the shapes that you created in the perspective lessons, light sources for each shape, and then we're going to be adding the shadows and the cast shadows to this. Just getting used to adding shadows depending on where the light source is. Also, once we've created all these shapes with the different light sources, it's good to keep this as a cheat sheet, so when you are drawing things in the future, you can just refer back to this and understand, or quickly glance at, oh, the light's up here, the shadow should be on this side, or this is how this shape should look. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, now that we've established the cast shadow, and then what we're going to do is use the information that we learned in the previous lesson about the light demo. We're going to use that as reference images, and then we're going to add some highlights and shadows to this image. So let's start off with the cube. So one thing I realized, and one thing I noticed, as you can see, is the light, because it's high, this top surface was always the brightest. This back one was always the darkest, and then this one was in between. So what I'm going to do first to start off is I'm going to rub away the guideline so it gives us a nice clean image. I like to do the cast shadow first, just so that we can go in and remove these lines, because if we do the highlights and the shadows first, then we're going to get left with a bunch of lines on our piece of paper. Let's just go in and remove most of them. So we've got our cube, we've got our cast shadow already added, and now we're going to go in. So like we said, the light was on this side, so the side facing, or the side opposite, which isn't facing the light, is always going to be the darkest. So first what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make the shadow a little bit darker, just so when we're adding the value to the cube, it doesn't affect it. And remember what we learned in the initial value class, where we learned how to make a gradient. This is where it comes in handy. Start off with the lightest value. And now for the face in between, I want to make that in between these two values. Make this side a little bit darker. That's the good thing about going in and adding your values ever so slightly. Then you can change it, whereas if you go super dark straight away, then you can't really go back. So what we're going to do now is going to move on to our sphere. Again, I'm going to start by erasing the guides. So before we get in, what I'm going to do is, one thing that we noted from the previous class is when the light shining on a sphere, that's where the highlights tend to roll off. So what we're going to do is, from here to the center, we're going to draw a straight line, and then from there with our shape, we're going to draw a perpendicular line, so where it's a right angle, just to make sure that we're drawing. And then what we want to do from here, we want to see where the intersection point is, and then just draw a straight line from there, and then the same on this side too. So it's about here, just like that. And then this point and this point is where your highlights are going to start to change. So what we want to do here, so from this point here, we want to start to create an oval, like so. So we can rub this side out, and we're just going to use the bottom half as a guide. So we got this here as a guide to where our highlights and our shadows need to start blending out. And then we're going to do a bigger circle down here too. This is where the darkest point is going to be. One thing we saw from the example as well is that the bottom part isn't exactly the darkest. The darkest part is just above it. That's because when the light's coming from here, it's going here, and then it's bouncing back up, which is causing this bottom bit to be a bit lighter. So we'll keep that in mind. So this top section, we're just going to very lightly, because we want to create a circle here. In the resources, there is a sheet here which can help you with it, which is giving you an understanding that like when the light is here, this part will be lightest, and then gradually it'll get darker, and this bottom section here will be the lighter, will be a little bit lighter than the actual darker section. Make sure with this, with the curved objects, you want to follow the curve of the shape as opposed to just harsh straight lines, because then that will make it more convincing too. So all I'm doing now is I'm just going through and I'm blending the values together. Again, following the guides that we put in initially. So now we've got a base. What we want to do is go in and refine it slightly now. So you want to start building on this. So we've got our shadow. We can add a bit more. We can add a bit more value to this. We can darken the values just to make it a bit more prominent. And what we can do, if you want, you can go in with your finger and you can blend this. You can blend this together to make it look a lot more smoother. But again, you can see as I'm blending, you follow the curve. This is one good thing about pencil, that you can use your finger and you can blend it out. But do be careful, because then you do end up with a black finger. So there's our two basic shapes that we've shaded. These are the two that are mainly used to create most things whilst you are drawing. So understanding how to light these and how to use a light source with these will become very useful. That's the reason why I've chosen these two shapes to do. Okay, some more practice. What I want you to do now is we want to apply the same thing to cylinders, cones. What I want to do is pick two light sources, and then I want you to draw these shapes. So we'll only need to do small sketches. There's no need to do big ones. So I'll be starting off with the cone. Feel free to follow along. This is something that I do want you to get used to. The reason why we're keeping it quite repetitive is to instill the concepts that we'll learn in this lesson. What I'm going to be doing is starting off with my cone. So here it is. So I'm going to have it there as reference. You can also use the references that we created in the previous lesson, but let's just get into it. So I'm going to start by drawing my vertical line and then a perpendicular horizontal line. Okay, so let's draw in our lines. So we can remove this center line, and we can remove that back line as well. So we saw, like say, we're going to have one line there, and then one line there. And like I'm doing, like there is some guides here. So if you do want to shade directly on here, then feel free to do that. And then, so this will be the darker section, because right now we're going to have the light coming from this section, and then we're going to have like a slight area where it's going to fade out. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to go in and shade this middle bit in. So as you can see, we've got our light coming from this direction. So what we're going to do is, so I'm just going to imagine, so my light was on this side. So imagine I'm going off the paper and my light source is here. So it's going to be going this way. So my shadow is going to be going back there, and then you can see the back end of it. It's going to go back here, and then now let's draw the same cone but have the light direction going from this side. I'm going to draw a much flatter cone now, just to kind of get an understanding. So we've got a much wider cone for this example, just to show you that the same thing can be applied. So like we said, we're going to have the light source coming from this direction. So we've got our cone shaded now. What we're going to do is we're going to go in and add a cast shadow. So my light source for this is definitely coming from this direction, over here maybe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down, find where the horizon is. So I'm going to go here, and then from here I'm going to find the center point of this circle. So I'd say about here. So from there to here I'm going to draw a straight line. And then from the light source to the center point line, which is here. This is going to be a long shadow because the light's much lower. So then from here we find the edge of the circle. We'll just go in and add our cast shadow like we've done before. And because this is a much more harsher transition, the shadow itself is going to be a lot more harsher too. So what I want you to do is do the exact same for your cylinder as well. Okay, so we've got our cylinder. So we're going to be doing the exact same thing for this. So first let's start off by drawing our cylinder. Because we've got the light coming from behind it, there's going to be a lot less that's going to be highlighted and a lot more that's going to be in the shadow. So all this here is going to be in the shadow, and then we've got this section here which is going to be the blend between the highlight and the shadow, and there is that little bit on the other end. So having a good understanding of how these shapes are formed, how the highlights and the shadows work on them is going to help you massively when you are wanting to create your own concepts. So do go through and experiment with all these different shapes, because these are the main building blocks of the shapes that we are going to use in the class project with the sketches I'm going to get you to do. So do take your time until you feel like you're ready, where you can move on and you're creating consistent highlight shadows, cast shadows with the shapes that you're creating. Okay, so that wraps it up for this section of this class. We've just covered a bunch of stuff on value, understanding how to create value, and then how to understand light in order to create a highlight, shadows, and cast shadows. I hope after going through this whole process of understanding the basics of values, going through and adding values to your shapes has given you a much better understanding of how lighting works within drawings in order to give it that realistic effect. And that, paired with the shapes drawn with perspective, gives the full illusion of a 3D object on a 2D surface. Do take as much time as you want in this section in order to make sure you reinforce the concepts that we've learned in the previous lessons. Okay, in the next few lessons we're going to be covering composition. Let's get to it.